Boring history for sleep. Surviving a medieval winter tonight. We travel back in time, back to a quiet medieval village, resting on the edge of a long and unforgiving winter. The harvest has ended. The air has grown sharp and cold, and the last golden leaves of autumn have fallen silently to the ground. Before we begin, if you enjoy slow, calming history designed to help you fall asleep, consider subscribing to the channel. New long-form history stories are released regularly, each one carefully written to be gentle, steady, and deeply relaxing. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us step softly into the past. The last days, before winter. Winter in the medieval world did not arrive suddenly. It approached slowly, almost politely, giving quiet warnings long before the first heavy snowfall. In the small village where our story rests, the signs were already clear. The mornings had grown colder. Frost now coated the fields before sunrise, forming delicate white crystals along the edges of harvested wheat stubble. Breath lingered visibly in the air. The villagers understood what this meant. Time was shortening, and preparation could no longer be delayed. By the time the second heavy snowfall arrived, the village had already settled into winter's rhythm. What had once felt like preparation now became routine. The sky remained a pale gray for days at a time. The sun, when it appeared, hovered low and weak above the horizon, offering light but very little warmth. Shadows stretched long, even at midday. The cold was no longer something that visited overnight. It stayed. It settled into wood, into stone, into bone. Inside the cottages, the greatest concern was warmth. There were no chimneys in many early medieval homes, only a central hearth, where smoke drifted slowly upward before escaping through small openings in the roof. The smoke did not always rise cleanly. Often it lingered, hanging in the upper air, stinging eyes and clinging to clothing. Yet the hearth was everything. It was the center of the home. Without it, winter would not simply be uncomfortable. It would be deadly. Each morning began with the same careful ritual. Before dawn, when the cold was at its deepest, someone would rise quietly from straw bedding and kneel beside the hearth. Beneath a thin layer of ash, glowing embers often still survived from the night before. If the embers had gone out completely, relighting the fire required precious tinder, dry straw, small twigs, sometimes bits of cloth. That was something no family wanted to waste. So the embers were guarded carefully. Ash was arranged deliberately at night to preserve heat. In the morning, breath visible in the freezing air, careful hands coaxed flame back to life. A small spark, a thin curl of smoke, then the gentle crackle of firewood catching. Warmth returned slowly, never instantly. Even with a steady fire, cottages remained cold. Walls made of timber and packed earth could not fully block the wind. On especially harsh days, icy drafts slipped through unseen cracks, brushing against ankles and hands. Families wore layers indoors, wool tunics, thick cloaks, wrapped scarves. Hats were often kept on, even while sleeping. There was no concept of separate indoor comfort. Winter was endured, not defeated. At night, the family gathered close to the hearth, arranging bedding nearby. Straw mattresses were thin and required constant adjustment. Over time, straw flattened and needed replacing. During winter, fresh straw was scarce, so what remained was shaken and redistributed carefully. Several family members often shared sleeping space to preserve warmth. Body heat mattered. Children slept between adults. Blankets, usually made of rough wool, were layered heavily. Still, cold lingered. The fields that had once been golden and alive with movement now stood empty. Harvest had ended weeks ago. What remained were carefully stacked bundles of straw and the faint scent of earth resting after months of labor. For medieval peasants, survival in winter depended almost entirely on what had been accomplished during the warmer seasons. There would be no growing crops beneath frozen soil, no fresh vegetables from the fields, no easy abundance. Everything depended on storage. Inside wooden cottages, quiet activity filled the final mild days of autumn. Grain was measured carefully and poured into heavy sacks. Barley, rye, and oats were stored in dry corners of cottages or in shared village granaries. Moisture was the enemy now. One leak in the roof could mean rot. One careless spill could mean hunger months later. Women and men alike worked steadily, not in panic, but with focused urgency. Meat, when available, had already been salted. Thin strips of pork hung from wooden beams above hearth fires, slowly drying in smoke. This process preserved what little protein most families would taste during the long, cold months ahead. Salt itself was precious. It was not easily obtained and never wasted. Water posed another challenge. Buckets drawn from the village well often froze overnight. Ice formed along the edges first, then gradually thickened inward. Breaking the surface required force, and carrying water in freezing air made fingers ache painfully within minutes. Inside cottages, small clay containers were sometimes kept near the fire to prevent total freezing. Even then, water was used sparingly. Bathing in winter was rare. Cleanliness gave way to survival. Food preparation also changed with the season. Fresh ingredients had disappeared weeks ago. Meals became repetitive and predictable. Thick porridge made from stored grain became a staple. It was filling, simple, and economical. Sometimes dried beans or peas were added to increase substance. Salted pork, when available, was shaved thinly and stretched across multiple meals. No portion was wasted. Vegetables stored in root cellars, turnips, onions, cabbages, were inspected frequently. Rot could spread quickly in damp conditions. Each meal required quiet calculation. How much now? How much later? Winter demanded patience not just from the body, but from the mind. Outside, snow deepened. Paths between cottages became narrow trenches, carved by repeated footsteps. The open fields, once wide and golden, now lay beneath thick white blankets. Their boundaries softened and blurred. Silence became more noticeable. Snow absorbed sound. Conversations carried less distance. Even animals moved more quietly. The world felt smaller, contained. Travel nearly stopped entirely. Roads between villages became unreliable. Ice formed beneath snow, making carts unstable. Rivers partially froze, their surfaces deceptive and dangerous. For most peasants, winter meant remaining close to home. Isolation was not unusual. It was expected. Livestock required daily attention despite the cold. Cows and goats needed feed from carefully stored hay. Animals produced warmth of their own, and some families kept smaller livestock closer to living quarters during extreme cold. The scent of hay, animals, and smoke blended into a constant background smell inside cottages. Chickens laid even fewer eggs now. Some stopped entirely until spring. Milk production decreased as well. Nature conserved its energy. Humans had to do the same. The greatest enemy during winter was not hunger alone. It was illness. Cold air, poor nutrition, and crowded sleeping arrangements created perfect conditions for sickness to spread. A simple cough could linger for weeks.
Fevers were common. There were no trained physicians nearby. Herbal remedies offered some comfort, but little certainty. Warm broth, rest near the fire, prayers whispered quietly. Sometimes people recovered, sometimes they did not. Winter reminded everyone of life's fragility.
Firewood became the village's greatest concern. Without fire, there would be no warmth. Without warmth, survival became uncertain. Throughout autumn, villagers had gathered fallen branches from nearby forests. Larger logs were cut carefully and stacked against cottage walls. Each family kept count in their own quiet way. Would it be enough? No one could know. Winters varied in severity. Some were merely uncomfortable. Others were devastating. The cottages themselves required attention. Most homes were built from timber frames, packed with wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and sticks. Over time, cracks formed. Autumn was the final opportunity to seal those cracks before icy winds forced their way inside. Small repairs were made daily. Hands pressed fresh mud into gaps. Roof thatching was reinforced with new bundles of straw. Shutters were tested to ensure they closed tightly against the coming storms. Comfort was not the goal. Survival was. As daylight hours shortened, the rhythm of village life began to shift. The sun now set earlier, casting long blue shadows across dirt paths before evening had fully arrived. Workdays grew shorter, not by choice, but by necessity. Candles were scarce. Oil lamps were limited. Artificial light was expensive and carefully rationed. When darkness fell, activity slowed naturally. The animals sensed the change as well. Chickens laid fewer eggs. Cows required more feed. Sheep huddled closer together during cold nights. Livestock represented both wealth and vulnerability. Losing an animal during winter could mean losing milk, meat, or future breeding. Simple shelters were reinforced. Hay was stacked inside barns to provide insulation and food. Doors were checked for stability. Snow drifting inside could be dangerous. Yet despite hardship, there were moments of quiet calm. Long evenings created space for stillness rarely found during harvest months. Tools were repaired beside the fire. Clothing was mended carefully. Stories were told softly, repeated from memory, passed down through generations. Children listened closely to tales of previous winters, of storms survived, of scarce years endured. These stories served a purpose. They reassured. If others had endured before, so could they. The rhythm of winter settled into repetition. Wake before sunrise, relight the fire, prepare porridge, feed animals, check supplies, mend what needed mending, wait for daylight to fade again. Time moved slowly. Without fields to tend, days felt longer, though daylight was shorter. The absence of urgent labor created space for reflection. Sometimes that stillness felt peaceful, other times heavy. Storms arrived without warning. Wind howled against cottage walls, rattling shutters violently. Snow piled high against doors. Drifts sometimes blocked entryways entirely. On such nights, no one ventured outside. The fire was fed carefully. Every crack of timber sounded louder. Every gust of wind felt closer. Yet even storms passed eventually. Morning revealed quiet landscapes reshaped by snow. And the cycle continued. As winter deepened, supplies diminished. Grain sacks felt lighter. Firewood stacks grew shorter. The cold did not weaken. If anything, it intensified. The middle months of winter were always the most difficult. Hope for spring felt distant. The sun seemed reluctant to climb higher, and endurance became the only strategy left. Inside one cottage, a father quietly examined the remaining firewood.
He counted not in numbers, but in days. If used carefully, perhaps enough. If storms increased, perhaps not. He added 1 log to the fire instead of 2. The flames dimmed slightly, but remained steady. Small decisions mattered now. Yet despite hardship, something remarkable endured. Community. Neighbors checked on one another during heavy snowfalls. If a roof sagged under weight, several men gathered to reinforce it. If illness struck one home, others shared what little herbs or food they could spare. Winter tested individuals, but it strengthened villages. Isolation was physical, but not emotional. Everyone understood the shared challenge. Everyone counted the days together. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the calendar turned. The darkest weeks approached their midpoint. The cold remained harsh. The wind remained sharp. But somewhere beyond the frozen fields, spring already waited. Not near enough to feel, not near enough to see, but inevitable. For now, though, winter still held its grip, and the village endured, quietly, patiently, steadily, through the deep freeze.
By the time winter reached its deepest point, the village no longer measured time by weeks. It measured time by supplies. The grain sacks that once felt heavy were now easier to lift. The salted meat hanging from rafters had grown thin. Even the firewood, stacked carefully against cottage walls, had shortened into uneven piles. This stretch of winter was known quietly, without formal name, as the hunger months. It was not always starvation, but it was always restraint. The days felt dim and compressed. Sunrise came late, casting a pale silver glow over frozen fields. The sun never climbed high enough to offer comfort. By mid-afternoon, shadows had already begun to lengthen again. The longest nights of the year wrapped around the village like a heavy cloak. Darkness lasted far longer than light, and darkness changed people. Inside the cottages, meals became smaller. Morning porridge was thinner now. More water, less grain. Where once a small shaving of salted pork might flavor a stew, now it was used only occasionally. Instead, dried peas or barley provided bulk. Families ate slowly, quietly, not because there was nothing to say, but because chewing took time, and slowing down made small portions feel larger. No one complained openly. Everyone understood the arithmetic of winter. If you eat more now, you eat less later. Children felt the hunger first. Their bodies demanded more fuel than winter allowed. Parents watched closely, dividing portions carefully. Sometimes adults skipped meals entirely, pretending not to be hungry. "I ate earlier," they might say. But the children knew, and the silence around the table carried that understanding. The body adjusted in subtle ways. Movement slowed. Conversations grew softer. Tasks were performed with measured energy. Unnecessary motion was avoided. Even walking across the village felt deliberate, conserving warmth and strength. Winter required efficiency. The cold during these weeks felt sharper than before, not because temperatures had dropped dramatically, but because bodies had grown thinner. Less fat meant less insulation. The wind found its way through wool layers more easily. Hands stayed closer to the fire. Nights required tighter huddling beneath blankets. The firewood problem became more serious. Families now burned smaller logs. Fires were allowed to shrink lower at night, risking colder sleep in exchange for preserving supply. The hearth no longer blazed brightly. It glowed, steady, controlled, measured. Outside, snow lay deep across fields and rooftops. Paths between cottages had narrowed into icy corridors. When fresh snow fell, the world appeared untouched and almost beautiful, smooth, white, silent. But beauty did not erase difficulty. Underneath the snow, the earth remained frozen solid. Livestock feed ran low as well. Hay stores had been calculated carefully in autumn, but animals required consistent nourishment. Cows grew leaner. Sheep huddled closely in barns. Each animal lost would represent not only immediate loss, but diminished recovery in spring. So villagers rationed animal feed just as carefully as their own. Illness during the hunger months carried greater danger. Weakened bodies struggled to fight infection. Coughs lingered longer. Fevers felt heavier. If someone fell sick during harvest season, recovery was more likely. If someone fell sick during deep winter, uncertainty grew. Herbal remedies were prepared from dried plants saved months earlier. Chamomile for comfort, sage for sore throats, garlic when available. But knowledge was limited. Hope played as large a role as medicine. The nights grew longer still. Without extended daylight labor, evenings stretched endlessly. After the final meal, families gathered close to the hearth. Tools were mended. Wool was spun into thread. Clothing was patched again and again, each garment growing more worn yet more precious. Stories filled the quiet, not dramatic tales, but familiar ones. Memories of earlier winters, of a storm that collapsed a barn roof, of a winter so mild that green shoots appeared early, of neighbors long gone. These stories did more than pass time. They reminded everyone that winter always ended, even when it felt endless. Sometimes, windstorms swept across the village at night. The sound was unsettling. Wooden beams creaked. Shutters rattled. Snow struck walls in sudden bursts. Children stirred uneasily in their sleep. Adults lay awake, listening carefully for any sign of damage. A loose roof tile, a cracked support beam. Winter required vigilance, even during rest. Yet amidst hardship, there were moments of surprising peace. On certain clear nights, when the wind fell silent and clouds parted, the sky revealed an extraordinary display of stars. Without modern light to dull their brilliance, constellations stretched vividly from horizon to horizon. Villagers sometimes stepped outside briefly, wrapped tightly in cloaks, just to look upward. The cold bit sharply at exposed skin, but the sky felt vast, endless. It reminded them that winter, no matter how oppressive, was only a small chapter in a much larger world. Inside the cottages, breath could sometimes be seen even while lying in bed. Blankets were pulled higher. Children pressed closer to parents. The fire reduced to embers. Sleep during hunger months was lighter, not because of fear, but because of discomfort. Hunger and cold rarely allowed deep rest. Yet exhaustion eventually prevailed, and each morning life resumed. By late autumn, the village grew quieter. Travel between settlements became less frequent. Merchants visited less often. Roads, soon to become muddy and eventually frozen, discouraged unnecessary movement. The world beyond the village began to feel distant. Winter had a way of shrinking the known world. Inside cottages, evenings were spent reviewing supplies. How much grain remained? How much salted meat? How many dried beans? Each household performed this quiet inventory in their own way. There were no written ledgers for most peasants, no accounting books, only memory and experience. Older villagers, those who had survived many winters before, offered calm advice. Stretch the grain. Do not burn too much wood early. Save the best for the coldest months. Experience was the closest thing they had to strategy. The first snowfall arrived softly. It came not as a storm, but as a gentle drifting from gray skies. At first, the children noticed. They stepped outside, watching flakes settle on their sleeves before melting. For a brief moment, snow felt magical, but adults understood its meaning. This was only the beginning. As days passed, snow accumulated along rooftops and fences. Dirt paths disappeared beneath pale layers of white. Sound itself seemed muted. The village grew quieter still. Winter had arrived, and now survival would depend not on preparation alone, but on endurance. Inside one small cottage at the edge of the village, a family gathered near their hearth as the fire crackled softly. The flames provided warmth, but only within a small circle of comfort. Beyond that circle, the air remained cold. Straw mattresses were rearranged closer to the hearth. Blankets were inspected for thin spots. The family spoke quietly about the months ahead. There would be no festivals soon, no markets, no long days in the sun, only cold mornings, rationed meals, and long nights. Yet there was something steady about winter as well. It forced stillness. It demanded patience. It slowed the world into a quieter rhythm. For medieval peasants, winter was not an interruption of life. It was part of life, an unavoidable season, a test repeated year after year. Outside, wind began to move gently across open fields, lifting loose snow into soft, swirling patterns. Inside, firelight flickered against wooden walls, and the village settled into its long winter sleep. This was only the beginning, because surviving a medieval winter was not about a single snowstorm. It was about enduring weeks and months of cold, hunger, darkness, and uncertainty. And as the days grow shorter and the nights grow longer, the true test is only just beginning. The middle of winter was the most difficult, not simply because supplies were low. It was difficult because hope felt far away. Autumn was memory. Spring was imagination. Only the present remained. Cold, gray, measured. Still, the human spirit adapts. Routine creates stability, even when conditions are harsh. Wake, relight the fire, prepare the thinnest possible porridge, feed the animals, inspect the roof, mend a cloak, conserve, wait, repeat. Repetition created predictability. Predictability created calm. Even hunger became familiar. In one cottage, a mother carefully divided the last remaining turnip into several thin slices. She added it to boiling water with a handful of barley. The aroma was faint, but warmth filled the room. The children watched patiently. No one rushed the meal. Eating slowly extended both nourishment and comfort. The village bell, when it rang on certain mornings, sounded sharper in the cold air. Church services during winter were shorter. Stone buildings held cold even worse than cottages, yet attendance continued. Faith offered structure, and structure offered reassurance. As weeks passed, subtle signs began to shift. The sun lingered slightly longer in the sky, not enough to feel warm, but enough to notice. Snow atop rooftops began to melt just a little on brighter afternoons. Tiny drips formed along edges before freezing again overnight. These were not dramatic changes, but they were observed carefully. Each small shift meant something. The hunger months would not last forever. They never had. Though the present moment felt stretched and heavy, time moved steadily forward, and beneath frozen soil, seeds from autumn still waited, invisible, silent, but alive. For now, the village endured the longest nights. It endured smaller meals. It endured colder mornings. And it endured together. Because surviving a medieval winter was not about comfort. It was about patience. And patience, though quiet, is powerful. By the time late winter arrived, the village no longer feared the cold in the same way it had at the beginning of the season. The cold was familiar now, expected. What the villagers feared instead were the storms, because late winter storms were different. They were heavier, wetter, more unpredictable, and far more dangerous. The sky often gave little warning. One afternoon might pass in pale gray stillness. The air would feel almost calm, almost manageable. Then, sometime after dusk, the wind would begin. At first, only a low whisper along the edges of cottages, then a steady push, then a howl. Snow no longer fell gently during these storms. It moved sideways, driven by wind so strong that it blurred vision entirely. Drifts piled high against doors. Barn entrances disappeared beneath white walls. Paths carved earlier in the season vanished within hours. Inside the cottages, families listened, not to the storm itself, but to the structure around them. Every creak mattered. Wood beams groaned under pressure. Thatched roofs strained beneath accumulated snow. Shutters rattled violently. A roof collapse during deep winter could be catastrophic. Repairs were nearly impossible in freezing wind. So men stayed alert through much of the night during heavy storms. Not pacing, not panicking, simply listening, waiting, ready to respond if needed. When morning finally arrived after such a storm, the world looked transformed. Snow rose nearly to window height in some areas. Barn doors required digging before they could be opened. Entire fences disappeared beneath smooth white surfaces. The village did not wake slowly after these nights. It moved immediately, shoveling paths, clearing roofs, checking livestock, because if animals remained trapped too long without air or feed, survival became uncertain. The effort required to dig through snow was immense. Tools were simple. Wooden shovels reinforced with iron edges when available. Hands numbed quickly, even inside wool gloves. Breath came in sharp clouds. Muscles burned. But stopping was not an option. Snow, if left unattended, could harden into ice. And ice was far more difficult to manage. Livestock suffered most during these storms. Cows, already lean from limited feed, stood close together for warmth. Sheep pressed tightly in corners of barns. If snow drifted into openings, interior temperatures dropped sharply. Villagers worked carefully to remove excess snow without exposing animals too long to open air. Each animal represented future recovery: milk in spring, wool, meat if absolutely necessary. Losing even one animal meant recovery from winter would take longer. Storms also increased illness. Cold, damp air made coughs deeper and more persistent. Chest infections spread quickly in crowded cottages. If one child developed fever, it was only days before others showed similar signs. There were no quarantines, no isolated rooms. Families shared the same air, shared the same bedding, shared the same fire. Illness, once introduced, moved quietly from one body to another. Herbal knowledge became especially important now. Dried thyme steeped in hot water, garlic crushed and mixed into broth, honey, when available, dissolved into warm drinks. These remedies did not guarantee recovery, but they provided comfort. And sometimes comfort is enough to strengthen the body's own defenses. The most dangerous illnesses were those that affected breathing. Cold air irritated lungs. Smoke from hearth fires filled cottages. Combined, they created heavy air. Coughing during winter nights echoed softly against wooden walls. Adults often lay awake, listening to the breathing of children beside them. Steady breathing meant safety. Interrupted breathing meant worry. Despite storms and sickness, daily life continued. It had to. Animals required feed whether one felt well or not. Firewood needed chopping, whether hands felt strong or weak. Winter did not pause for illness. It demanded endurance. The psychological strain of late winter began to show. Not in loud arguments, not in visible despair, but in silence. Conversations grew shorter, movements slower. The excitement that had accompanied the first snowfall months ago had long disappeared. Now there was only waiting, waiting for sunlight, waiting for warmth, waiting for signs of change. One evening, after a particularly violent storm, the village gathered briefly in the small church. The building was cold. Stone walls radiated chill even more than wooden cottages. But gathering together created reassurance. Candles flickered along the front altar. Breath hung visibly in the air. Prayers were quiet and simple. Not dramatic pleas, just steady requests for strength, for health, for survival. Community mattered most during these weeks. If one family's roof suffered damage, others helped reinforce it. If one cottage ran critically low on grain, neighbors sometimes shared small portions. No one had abundance, but small sacrifices prevented disaster. Winter reminded everyone that survival was collective. No one endured entirely alone. Yet even in hardship, nature offered subtle beauty. After storms passed and skies cleared, the air sometimes became incredibly still. Trees stood coated in ice, branches glittering in faint sunlight. Snow reflected light so brightly that the village seemed almost luminous despite the cold. The silence following a storm felt complete, total, almost sacred. In those moments, winter felt less like an enemy and more like a powerful force to be respected. As days passed, the angle of the sun shifted gradually, still low, still cold, but slightly different. Snow began to melt just a little along southern-facing walls. Icicles formed along rooftops, dripping slowly during midday before freezing again at night. These small signs did not end hardship, but they changed its tone. There was movement now, subtle but present. Supplies, however, were at their lowest point. Grain sacks nearly empty. Firewood reduced to short, uneven pieces. Animals thinner than ever. This was the edge of desperation. Not widespread starvation, but vulnerability. If one more severe storm arrived, if illness took one more family member, if firewood ran out too soon, the consequences would be real. And yet, the village endured, because winter, no matter how harsh, could not last forever. The earth rotated steadily. The sun rose slightly higher each day. The length of daylight increased by small but measurable minutes. Children noticed first. "It is lighter longer," they would say. And they were right. Inside cottages, conversations began to shift slightly, not toward celebration, but toward planning. Seeds stored carefully since autumn were inspected. Tools were checked. Blades sharpened slowly beside the hearth. Hope returned not as excitement, but as preparation. Late winter was the final test. Storms continued. Illness lingered. Hunger remained present. But beneath all of it, something new stirred. The certainty of change, not yet visible in fields, not yet warm in air, but undeniable. The hardest part of winter was not the cold itself. It was believing that warmth would return. And now, slowly, that belief strengthened. The storms grew less frequent. The wind softened slightly. The snow, though still deep, showed faint signs of retreat. The village had endured the edge of desperation, and it remained standing. The change did not arrive all at once. There was no single morning when the villagers stepped outside and declared that winter had ended. Instead, it began quietly, almost invisibly, with light. One morning, just before dawn, the eastern horizon carried a slightly softer shade of blue than it had in weeks before. It was subtle, easy to miss. But those who rose early to relight their hearth fires noticed that the darkness did not feel as heavy. It lifted more quickly. The sky brightened sooner. The day, though still cold, lasted longer. Inside the cottages, routines remained the same. The fire was coaxed back to life from hidden embers. Porridge was prepared carefully from the final portions of grain. Animals were fed with the last of stored hay. Yet something in the air felt different. The cold, though present, carried a gentler edge. It bit less sharply against exposed skin. It lingered less aggressively in breath. As the sun climbed slightly higher in the sky each day, its light began to interact with the snow differently. Rooftops facing south showed the first signs. Thin streams of water formed along thatched edges during midday, dripping steadily onto packed snow below. The sound of dripping, steady, rhythmic, became a new presence in the village. After months of silence and frozen stillness, movement had returned. Water was moving again. The ground, still frozen beneath its surface, began to soften at the very top layer. Paths between cottages grew damp. Footsteps left impressions not just in snow, but in mud beneath melting patches. The air smelled different too, faintly earthy, as though the soil beneath the ice had begun to breathe again. Children noticed before anyone else. They stepped outside during the warmer hours of the afternoon and discovered that snow no longer felt as solid beneath their boots. It collapsed slightly. It yielded. Where drifts had once risen high and firm, they now slumped gently at the edges. Laughter returned in small bursts, careful at first, then more freely. Adults remained cautious. They had seen false thaws before. Moments when warmth arrived briefly, only to be replaced by another storm. Winter had a way of resisting departure, but this change felt steady, gradual, persistent. The sun's arc continued to rise higher, day by day. Inside the barns, animals sensed it too. Cows shifted more restlessly. Sheep bleated with renewed energy. The air inside animal shelters grew slightly less suffocating as doors were opened briefly during mild afternoons. Fresh air moved through the space, and with it came a subtle shift in scent. The smell of thawing earth. Supplies inside cottages had nearly reached their lowest point. Grain was measured carefully. Firewood stacks were thin. Yet the knowledge that winter's hold was weakening changed the emotional weight of scarcity. Hunger remained. Cold persisted at night, but the certainty of relief had begun. And certainty can sustain the spirit, even when food cannot. The first true sign of spring came not from the sky, but from the sound beneath the snow. One afternoon, as the sun lingered longer than it had all winter, faint trickling could be heard beyond the village. Small streams, frozen solid for months, had begun to loosen. Water moved cautiously beneath thin sheets of ice. Cracks formed. Light reflected off uneven surfaces. The river was waking. Villagers gathered along its banks carefully, testing the ice with long sticks. No one trusted its strength yet, but seeing water flow again, however slowly, felt like witnessing the return of life itself. The river had endured, just as they had. Roof repairs, long delayed by freezing temperatures, resumed. Thatched straw loosened by storms was replaced. Mud walls were inspected and patched again. This time not to keep cold out, but to prepare for the coming rains. Because thaw brought a new challenge. Mud. Paths that had once been firm beneath snow became thick and slippery. Boots sank deep into softened ground. Carts could not yet move freely. But no one complained. Mud meant warmth. Mud meant the earth was alive again. Inside the church, services grew slightly longer, not because of urgency, but because relief allowed space for gratitude. Candles burned more steadily in milder air. Voices carried differently, less strained, less weary. At night, the cold still returned. Frost formed along cottage windows, but it melted more quickly after sunrise. The fire, though still necessary, required fewer logs. Families noticed the difference in wood consumption. For the first time in months, firewood might outlast the season. Conversations shifted fully toward planting. Seed sacks, carefully preserved since autumn, were brought down from shelves. They were opened and inspected. Small, dry kernels held in calloused hands represented the future, if planted at the right time, if protected from late frost, if given sufficient rain. These seeds would replace what winter had taken. The animals began to show visible change. Milk production increased slightly as temperatures rose. Hens, responding to longer daylight hours, laid more eggs. The return of fresh food, however small, felt miraculous. A single egg on a wooden table held more promise than an entire sack of grain months earlier. Because it signaled renewal, snow retreated in stages, first from rooftops, then from south-facing fields, then from open spaces where wind carried warmth more effectively. Large drifts remained in shaded areas, stubborn and slow to melt. But their edges receded day by day. Water pooled in shallow depressions across the fields. Reflections of pale blue sky shimmered on their surfaces. The village began to stretch. After months of confined movement, people walked further. Children ran short distances. Neighbors lingered longer outside cottages. The air no longer stung their lungs. It filled them gently. One evening, as the sun dipped lower, yet remained visible longer than anyone had seen in months, the sky transformed into soft shades of gold and pink. The snow, now patchy and uneven, reflected the colors warmly. For a moment, the entire village seemed bathed in quiet celebration. No words were spoken. None were needed. The light itself carried meaning. Winter had not been defeated. It had completed its cycle, and the village had endured. The final weeks of thaw required patience still. Late frosts threatened early planting. Unexpected cold nights reminded everyone that spring could be fragile. But fear no longer dominated. Confidence grew, because each morning now brought unmistakable change. The earth softened. The air warmed. Birdsong returned faintly at dawn. Small, persistent chirps from branches long silent. And then, one morning, someone noticed it. Near the edge of a field, where snow had melted completely, a faint green shoot pushed through dark soil. Tiny, fragile, but unmistakable. Life had returned. The hunger months would soon end. Fresh greens would follow. Fields would be turned once more. Carts would roll across firm ground. But even before planting began, hope had already arrived, because the village had survived. Not easily, not comfortably, but completely. The medieval winter had tested patience, strength, and community. It had reduced supplies to their thinnest margins. It had pushed bodies toward weakness and spirits toward quiet endurance. And yet, the sun rose higher, the river flowed again, the earth breathed, and the village remained. Now, as evening settles softly over thawing fields, and the last patches of snow glimmer faintly beneath a gentle sky, you can imagine the warmth slowly returning to stone and timber. The hearth fire burns smaller tonight, not because it must, but because it can. The air feels different, lighter, kinder, and as the medieval village prepares to step into spring, you too can let the long winter fade gently from your mind. The cold has passed, the hunger has eased, the light has returned, and everything feels calm again. By the time most of the snow had withdrawn into shaded corners and narrow ditches, the village no longer felt trapped. It felt cautious. Winter was not forgotten, but it was behind them. Now the work of beginning again quietly unfolded. The first task was not planting. It was observing. Fields that had lain frozen and silent for months needed to be studied carefully. Too much moisture could rot seed. Soil still stiff with cold would reject growth. So the villagers walked slowly across their land, boots pressing into damp earth, testing its firmness. Mud clung thickly at first, but beneath the surface, the soil felt promising. Cool, dark, alive. The air carried a different sound now, not the hollow whistle of winter wind, but the soft hum of movement. Water flowed steadily through reopened streams. Birds returned in small groups, landing on fence posts and thatched roofs. Their calls were cautious, but persistent, as if they too were testing whether winter had truly loosened its grip. Inside the barns, tools were brought out from their resting places. Wooden plows leaned against walls. Iron blades, dulled by months of stillness, were examined. Men sat on low stools outside cottages, sharpening edges carefully with whetstones. The scraping sound was slow and repetitive, stone against metal, back and forth. Patient preparation. The plow was the most important instrument of early spring. Without it, seed could not enter the soil properly. And so oxen, lean but steady, were harnessed once more. Their breath still rose visibly in the cool morning air, but the frost no longer formed thick layers on their hides. They shifted their weight as wooden yokes were secured across their shoulders. The season of pulling had begun again. The first furrow drawn across the thawed earth was quiet, but meaningful. As the blade cut into the soil, dark ribbons of earth rolled gently to the side. The smell rose immediately, rich, deep, almost sweet after months of frozen sterility. The villagers paused briefly to observe the texture. If the soil crumbled cleanly, planting would succeed. If it clumped too heavily, more wading might be necessary. This year the soil yielded well. Winter had not stolen its strength. Women followed behind the plow in some fields, breaking apart larger clods with wooden tools. Children carried small baskets, removing stones uncovered by the turning earth. Everyone moved steadily, not rushed. Spring labor required rhythm rather than speed. Too much haste could undo careful preparation. Seed selection was handled with care. Grain saved from autumn had been guarded through the harshest months. Now, small handfuls were examined. Any kernels damaged by moisture were discarded. Only the strongest would be planted, because the margin for error remained narrow. Winter had left stores thin. A failed crop would not be easily survived. The first seeds were sown in quiet concentration, handfuls scattered evenly across prepared rows. Some were pressed gently into the soil with boots. Others were covered by dragging light wooden boards behind the plow. There was no dramatic ceremony, only practiced motion, a ritual repeated every year. The sky above seemed wider now. Without snow muting the landscape, colors returned gradually. Brown fields stretched toward pale blue horizons. Patches of early green appeared in sheltered areas. The river ran fuller as melted snow fed its flow. Its sound was constant and reassuring. With daylight extending further into evening, workdays grew longer naturally. There was no need for artificial light. The sun lingered generously. Its warmth was not yet strong, but it was steady. Faces turned toward it instinctively. After months of pale light and shadow, warmth felt like a gift. The animals, too, responded to the change. Oxen moved with renewed energy as they worked. Chickens scratched eagerly at soft ground near cottages. Sheep ventured further from barn doors during midday hours. Milk production improved noticeably. Egg baskets filled more frequently. Fresh food slowly re-entered the household routine. Not in abundance, but enough to shift the atmosphere. Inside cottages, cleaning began. Winter had left soot along beams and smoke stains near hearth openings. Straw bedding was replaced with fresher material gathered from storage. Doors were left open briefly during mild afternoons, allowing fresh air to circulate through rooms long sealed against cold. The scent of damp wool and smoke faded gradually, replaced by earth and wind. The church bell rang with a slightly brighter tone now. Sound carried differently in warmer air. Gatherings felt lighter, not because responsibilities had lessened, but because possibility had returned. Despite renewed activity, caution remained. Late frosts were not uncommon. A single cold snap could damage early shoots, so villagers watched the sky carefully each evening. Cloud patterns were studied, wind direction noted, experience guided expectation. Older farmers remembered years when spring had teased warmth, only to retreat suddenly. Patience, even in hope, remained essential. As days passed, small green lines began to appear across newly planted fields, thin and delicate at first, barely visible against dark soil, but unmistakable. The seeds had taken root. What had been hidden beneath frozen ground for months now reached upward toward light, and with each morning the green grew stronger. Children ran along field edges, careful not to step into planted rows. Their laughter carried freely across open space. Winter had restricted movement. Spring encouraged it. Energy returned to limbs that had grown stiff indoors. The village square regained its quiet liveliness. Neighbors exchanged observations about planting depth and rainfall. Small bundles of herbs were traded. Tools were borrowed and returned. Isolation faded as roads became passable again. Merchants would soon return. Travel between villages would resume. The world expanded once more. One afternoon, a light rain fell across the valley. Not the harsh sleet of winter storms, but a gentle, steady shower. It soaked into turned earth, darkening its surface. No one ran for cover immediately. Instead, many stood beneath it briefly, allowing it to fall across their faces. Rain now meant nourishment, not discomfort. The riverbanks, once rigid with ice, softened fully. Grass sprouted thickly along the edges. Small insects returned. Fish stirred beneath the surface. Life unfolded in layers, subtle, persistent. The work of preparing fields continued for weeks. Every available patch of land was turned and planted. Barley, rye, oats, beans, each crop chosen carefully according to soil condition and family need. The memory of winter's scarcity guided decisions. Plant enough. Plant wisely. Prepare again. Evenings no longer required heavy cloaks indoors. The hearth fire, though still lit, burned lower. Its glow was comforting, but no longer essential for survival. Families sat outside more often, watching the sun dip slowly below fields, breathing air no longer sharp with frost. And as the green shoots strengthened and lengthened, covering the fields in faint waves of color, the village understood something deeply familiar. Winter had tested them, but spring had answered, not with dramatic rescue, but with steady renewal. The cycle had completed once more. Preparation, endurance, survival, and now, growth. As night settles gently across newly planted fields and the last light fades softly beyond the horizon, the village rests differently than it did in winter. There is fatigue now, but it is the fatigue of work fulfilled, not of hunger endured. The air is mild, the ground soft, the future visible in green lines stretching across earth. And as the medieval village drifts into peaceful sleep beneath a quiet spring sky, you too can let your thoughts settle. The long winter has passed. The fields are alive again, and everything feels steady, calm, renewed. And now, as the village rests beneath the quiet night sky, and the fields lie calm in the soft spring air, it's time for you to rest as well. If you enjoyed this slow journey through history, and you'd like more peaceful stories to help you relax and fall asleep, you can subscribe to the channel. New long-form history stories are released regularly, each one designed to be calm, steady, and gently immersive. Thank you for spending this quiet time here. Now, let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts soften and drift into deep, restful sleep. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.